My sister grabbed the microphone at our grandmother's memorial gala, stood in front of 200 family friends and business associates, and announced that I had been permanently removed from our family's estate and that my entire inheritance had been transferred to her and her husband, effective immediately. She smiled at the crowd like she was presenting an award. She thought they would clap. She thought I would cry. Instead, the attorney who had drafted my grandmother's trust for the last 22 years slowly rose from his seat at table 1, set down his champagne, and the color drained from my sister's face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. That moment was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the end of a very long con, and my sister had just confessed to all of it in front of everyone who mattered. But I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of what happened that night makes sense without understanding what my grandmother built, what my sister wanted, and what I do for a living. Because what I do for a living is the whole reason any of this unraveled the way it did. I am a forensic accountant. I have been doing this work for 8 years. My job, in the simplest terms, is to follow the money when someone claims the money went somewhere it shouldn't have. Fraud, embezzlement, hidden assets in divorce cases, insurance schemes. I sit down with documents that were meant to deceive, and I find the exact moment the numbers stop telling the truth. I am very good at it. My sister knew what I did. She had just apparently convinced herself that I would never turn that skill on my own family. She was wrong. My grandmother passed away 14 months ago. She was 81, sharp until the very end, and she had spent the last decade of her life meticulously organizing what she was leaving behind. The estate was not enormous by some standards, but it was significant. A 4-bedroom house in Scottsdale that had tripled in value over 30 years, a commercial property in Phoenix that she leased to a small medical office, a brokerage account, and a life insurance policy. All of it, every single piece, had been placed inside a revocable living trust that converted to an irrevocable trust the day she died. The attorney who structured the trust was a man I had known since I was 11 years old. He and my grandmother had worked together for decades, and in the years before she passed, she had named me as the successor trustee. Not because I was her favorite, though I like to believe I was, because she knew what I did, and she trusted me to be precise. She told me once, sitting at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, that she had worked too hard and too long to let her estate become a battle. She wanted it handled like a business. She wanted someone who understood fiduciary duty, not just family loyalty. My sister had never forgiven her for that decision. My sister is 4 years older than me. She married her husband 6 years ago in a big wedding in Sedona that our grandmother helped pay for. He is a real estate developer, or at least, that's what he calls himself. What he actually is a man who has started and dissolved 4 LLCs in 7 years, who carries the kind of debt that makes financial professionals wince, and who has been quietly, persistently orbiting the idea of my grandmother's estate since the moment he realized she had one. My sister loves him. I believe that. I also believe he recognized exactly what she was worth the moment he met her, and I do not mean that as a compliment to either of them. After the trust became irrevocable, I began the administrative process. I inventoried the assets, notified the beneficiaries, began the required legal filings. My sister and I were equal beneficiaries under the original trust, 50% each after taxes and distributions. It was straightforward, clean, exactly the kind of structure my grandmother would have designed. Then, 8 months ago, my sister called me. She and her husband had found an opportunity, she said, a commercial development project in Tempe. Her husband's firm had the inside track. It was going to be transformative, she said, using a word I suspected he had coached her on. They needed capital. And since the estate was technically liquid enough, and since I was the trustee, couldn't I just release her portion early? Just her 50%. They would handle everything from there. I told her I couldn't do that. An irrevocable trust does not work that way. There are legal distribution timelines, tax obligations, required filings. Releasing assets outside of those parameters would expose both of us to IRS scrutiny and potentially breach the terms of the trust itself. I explained this as gently and clearly as I could. She went quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then she said, Grandma always said you made everything too complicated. And she hung up. That was the last real conversation we had before the gala. The memorial gala was my idea, which in retrospect is almost funny. My grandmother had asked that we mark the first anniversary of her passing with something that reflected her life, not just her death. She had been a member of her local community garden, her church auxiliary, her neighborhood association. She had fed people, organized people, shown up for people for 50 years. I wanted to honor that. I booked a venue. I invited her friends and her neighbors and her former colleagues. I put together a slideshow of photographs, spanning 8 decades of a life well lived. My sister offered to handle the catering, which I agreed to because I thought it was her way of participating. She had seemed, if not warm, at least cooperative in the weeks leading up to the event. I should have looked more closely at the quiet. The evening started beautifully. The room smelled like her. Gardenias and warm bread and something faintly citrus from the floral arrangements my sister had ordered. 200 people who loved my grandmother moved through the space with the particular tenderness of people who are grieving and celebrating at the same time. The attorney was there, seated at a front table with his wife and 2 colleagues, because my grandmother had asked me specifically to invite him. He had been her friend, not just her lawyer, and she had wanted him included. My sister stood at the podium just after 8 o'clock. I assumed she was going to say something about our grandmother. I assumed, wrongly and completely, that whatever complicated feelings existed between us had been set aside for one evening out of respect for the woman who had loved us both. She held a manila envelope. I noticed it but didn't register it. I was standing near the back of the room with a glass of sparkling water, watching the slideshow loop behind her. She began with something that sounded like a tribute. A few lines about our grandmother's strength, her generosity, her vision. People nodded. People smiled. I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't immediately understand. And then she said my name. She said it the way you say the name of someone who has done something wrong. With weight, with deliberate pause before and after. She said that our grandmother, in her final months, had expressed concerns about my management of the estate. She said that after consulting with a legal advisor of her own, she had located a trust amendment, signed and dated, that modified the distribution terms and appointed her as sole trustee and primary beneficiary. She opened the envelope and held up a document. She said she was sharing this tonight because transparency mattered to her. She said she was sorry it had come to this. She said she hoped our grandmother was at peace knowing the estate was in the right hands. The room had gone very, very still. I stood at the back, my glass of sparkling water in my hand, and I did not move. Not because I was frozen, because I was thinking. I knew every document my grandmother had signed in the last 4 years of her life. I had been present for most of them, and for the ones I hadn't witnessed personally, I had copies. I had reviewed the trust with the attorney 6 months prior. There had been no amendment. There was no amendment. What my sister was holding was either a document that didn't exist or a document that had been created to look like it existed. And I knew, with the particular cold clarity that comes from 8 years of doing what I do, exactly what that meant. The attorney was already on his feet. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He had the kind of presence that fills a room without effort, the bearing of a man who has spent 40 years being the most precise person in any conversation. He apologized to the guests for the interruption. He said, clearly and without hesitation, that he had drafted every document in that trust, had maintained the original and all copies, and that no amendment of any kind had been executed, filed, or communicated to him at any point during or after my grandmother's lifetime. He said he would need to see that document. My sister's hand, the one holding the envelope, dropped about 2 inches. Her husband, seated at the head table, went absolutely rigid. She tried to recover. She said her own attorney had confirmed its validity. She said the original attorney might not have been informed. She said there were things about our grandmother's final wishes that even he might not have known. He looked at her with the patient, unimpressed expression of a man who has heard every variation of this argument in a courtroom. He said he would be happy to review it with her right now, this evening, in front of anyone who wished to remain. He said that if the document was legitimate, he would be the first to acknowledge it. He said that if it was not, the appropriate authorities would need to be contacted. I set down my water glass and walked to the front of the room. I had not planned for this night to go this way, but I had, about 6 weeks earlier, begun to suspect that something was wrong. It had started with a phone call from the escrow company managing the rental property, a voice I didn't recognize, asking to confirm a change of authorized contact for the account. I had not authorized any change. I made a note. I did not call my sister. I called the attorney, quietly, and I told him I wanted a full review of any correspondence related to the estate in the past year. What he found was not the amendment, not yet. What he found was a letter that had been sent to the brokerage holding the investment account, signed with my name, requesting an address change for account statements. The address it listed was my sister's. The signature was close, but not mine. If you knew what to look for, you would see it. I knew what to look for. I had spent the 5 weeks before the gala documenting everything. I had the original letter from the brokerage with the fraudulent signature. I had records of 2 phone calls made to the commercial property management company, both from a number registered to my brother-in-law, neither of which I had authorized. I had the attorney's confirmation that no amendment existed in any jurisdiction where such a document would have been legally filed. And I had, because I am a forensic accountant, and I had been doing this for 8 years, a very complete picture of what my sister and her husband had been trying to build. They were not trying to steal my inheritance in one dramatic move. They had been trying to redirect it in small, deniable pieces. Change an address here. Update a contact there. Establish a paper trail that made it look like authority over the estate was shifting. And then, when enough quiet groundwork had been laid, produce a document that formalized what they had been trying to make look inevitable. The amendment my sister held up that night was the final piece. It was also the piece that ended everything, because she produced it in public, in front of a room full of witnesses, including the one man alive who could immediately and definitively say it was false. I stood beside the attorney at the front of the room, and I asked my sister to hand me the document. She looked at her husband. He gave the smallest, almost imperceptible shake of his head. She looked back at me. For a moment, I saw something cross her face that was not anger and not defiance. It was the expression of someone who has just realized that the board they were standing on has no floor beneath it. She handed me the document. I looked at it for about 30 seconds. I recognized the notary stamp. I had seen it before, on an unrelated filing, in the records I had pulled 6 weeks earlier. It was a notary who had been suspended by the state of Arizona 14 months ago, 5 months before the date on this amendment, for improper acknowledgement practices. The stamp should not have existed on a document dated after the suspension. The suspension was public record. It took 11 seconds to find on the state licensing website. I handed it to the attorney without a word. He read it, then looked at the stamp, then looked at my sister with an expression that had moved past professional and into something closer to grief. I will spare you the exact sequence of what happened next, because it is less dramatic than you might expect and more devastating. There were no screaming matches. There was no scene. My brother-in-law stood up from the head table, walked to my sister, put a hand on her back, and said they were leaving. She did not protest. The room parted for them. 200 people who had come to honor my grandmother watched them walk out with the quiet, collective weight of people who have just witnessed something they cannot unfold. The attorney asked to speak with me privately. We stepped into a side corridor. "I know," I said, before he could start. He looked at me the way people look at you when they cannot find the right words for how sorry they are. "How long?" he asked. "I think about 8 months," I said. "Maybe longer." He nodded. His face had settled into something professionally controlled, but privately heartbroken. He had known my grandmother for 22 years. He had watched me and my sister grow up through the lens of this family's paperwork. He said, carefully, that we needed to report this, that what had been presented tonight, combined with what I had already documented, constituted attempted fraud, that the forged signature on the brokerage letter was potentially criminal, that the fabricated notary stamp was certainly criminal. "I know," I said again. We called the estate attorney's paralegal at 9:45 that night, and she began drafting the formal complaint. I called my own legal counsel, a woman who specializes in trust litigation, on the drive home. She did not sound surprised. She had heard this story before in different clothes. She told me to send her everything I had compiled and to not contact my sister or my brother-in-law directly. She said everything from this point forward went through her. I texted my mother that night. I told her I loved her and that I was sorry she had witnessed what she had and that I would explain everything when I could. She did not text back that night. I understood. The weeks that followed were procedurally exhausting and emotionally strange. My sister and her husband retained a criminal defense attorney, which told me everything about how their own counsel was reading the situation. There were preliminary hearings. There were document requests. There were phone calls I did not take. My brother-in-law's fourth LLC, the one he had been running since the year before the gala, was examined as part of the investigation, and it turned out to have problems of its own, the kind that interested people beyond our family case. My sister called me once, about 3 weeks after the gala. I answered because I had been waiting for it. She did not apologize. She said she needed me to understand that things had gotten out of hand, that it had started as just wanting what was fair, that I needed to see my role in making her feel shut out. I listened to all of it. I had learned, through years of interviewing people who had taken things that didn't belong to them, that the story someone tells themselves about why they did it is always more revealing than the act itself. When she was finished, I said, "I loved you, and I wanted to keep loving you, but you didn't try to talk to me. You tried to take what was mine and make it look like it was always yours. That's not a family problem. That's a legal one, and it's going to be handled legally." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said my name the way she used to say it when we were children, and she was about to ask me to keep a secret. I recognized it and I hardened against it deliberately, the way you harden against something that once worked on you and no longer can. I told her my attorney would be in touch, and I ended the call. The legal process resolved in the way that legal processes often do, not with the clean, dramatic verdict of a courtroom scene, but with a negotiated agreement that landed somewhere between what everyone deserved and what everyone feared. My brother-in-law, whose separate LLC complications had generated independent interest from the state attorney general's office, had very little leverage. The forged document was not deniable. The suspended notary stamp was not explainable. My sister's attorney negotiated a restitution agreement and a formal disclaimer of any claim against the estate in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution. My attorney accepted the terms because pursuing criminal charges would have cost more years and more money than the outcome justified, and because, honestly, she told me my grandmother would not have wanted her granddaughters in opposite corners of a courtroom. I agreed. I was not happy about agreeing, but I agreed. My brother-in-law's LLC issues resolved separately and considerably less favorably for him. I was not involved in that outcome, and I will not pretend I was not satisfied by it. My relationship with my parents is the part of this story that does not have a clean ending, and I will not manufacture one. My mother spent 3 months not calling me. When she finally did, she said things that were true, and things that were unfair, and some things that were both at the same time. She said she understood what my sister had done. She said she also believed that I could have handled it differently, that going public at the gala was cruel. I told her I had not chosen that venue. My sister had. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she knew that and was sorry. We are rebuilding something. It is slow, and it is fragile, and some days it feels real, and some days it feels like two people being very careful around something broken. I think that is the most honest thing I can say about it. My sister and I have not spoken since that one phone call. I do not know what her life looks like now. I have heard, through the particular osmosis of family information, that you can never fully stop, that she and her husband are still together, that they moved to a different city, that she is working. I hope she is okay. I mean that in the way that I mean it, not warmly and not coldly, just genuinely, from a distance, the way you hope for someone you have accepted you cannot save. The estate was distributed according to the original trust terms. My 50%, my grandmother's house in Scottsdale, half the brokerage account, my portion of the commercial property income. I did not celebrate. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen the first night I was legally permitted to call it mine, at the same table where she had once told me she wanted her estate handled like a business, and I drank a cup of black coffee, and I let myself cry for about 20 minutes. Then I washed the cup, set it back in the cabinet, and started making a list. The commercial property needed a new lease structure. The brokerage account needed to be rebalanced for the first time in 6 years. The house needed a new water heater and a conversation with a contractor about the roof. There was a lot of work to do, and I was, in the most fundamental sense, the right person to do it. I am sitting in that kitchen right now, as I tell you this. It still smells faintly like her, like gardenias and coffee and something warm underneath both. The water heater has been replaced. The contractor is scheduled for next month. The lease has been renewed with a cost of living clause she probably should have included years ago but didn't, and I drafted it myself, because that is what I do. My phone buzzed an hour ago. It was the attorney, checking in on the final distribution paperwork. I wrote back that everything was in order, and that I would drop off the last set of signatures on Thursday. He wrote back 3 words: she'd be proud. I sat with that for a long time. I am not a person who believes that surviving something makes you stronger in any automatic or guaranteed way. I have seen too many people hollowed out by betrayal to believe that narrative unconditionally. What I believe is that the tools you had before the crisis are the same tools you have during it, and that the only difference is whether you choose to use them. I had 8 years of knowing how to follow a number until it told the truth. I had a woman who built something real and asked me to protect it. I had a mentor who stood up in a room of 200 people and said, "That document is false." I used the tools. I protected the thing. The document was false, and now I am sitting in her kitchen, with her coffee cup in my hand, and I am already thinking about what comes next.